Accused killer Nick Reiner begging for access to his trust fund, set up by his murdered parents decades ago. Reiner argues he has the right to more than $1 million, and he's going to use it to fund his defense. But what are the odds of that really happening? This is Scandal, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Gillespie. Nick Reiner making waves once again, this time allegedly begging for access to a portion of his trust fund to the tune of $1.5 million. Nick Reiner reportedly wants access to this money to pay for his defense because he's charged with the murder of his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, the same people who, by the way, set up this trust fund for their middle son 3 decades ago. And I just can't stress this enough. The same people who created this trust fund, his own parents, are the ones that Nick Reiner is accused of killing. We've been following this case since it broke last December when Rob and Michelle Reiner were found murdered in their Brentwood, California home. Their son, 32-year-old Nick Reiner, was arrested shortly thereafter. Now, since then, the case has seen its share of ups and downs. Nick was repped by defense heavyweight Alan Jackson before Jackson stepped down. At the time, he didn't give a concrete reason, but we all speculated it could have been related to money. Since then, Nick Reiner has been repped by the Los Angeles County Public Defender's Office, but he's asking for a change. He just filed petition for access to his trust fund in order to pay for a defense. This filing, obtained by the Los Angeles Times, reads in part, quote, "Nick loved his parents and he is devastated by their deaths. But the facts about what did and did not happen to them are not an issue in this trust litigation. Nick's criminal defense attorneys will present those facts in the criminal case. This petition neither requires nor invites this court to weigh in on them. Like anyone accused of a crime, Nick is presumed innocent, and he is entitled to mount his defense with the resources that are lawfully his own." According to Nick's civil attorneys, this trust was created more than 30 years ago. Rob and Michelle Reiner established trust for all 3 of their children, Jake, Romy, and Nick. According to Nick's team, he's requesting a smaller trust that isn't part of this larger family trust. The filing goes on to state, quote, "Those trusts and Nick's interest in them are not at issue here. The terms of Nick's trust are not complicated, and they are not subject to reasonable dispute. Nick's parents left unambiguous instructions about when the funds in the trust were to be released to him. 1/2 of the trust was required to be distributed to Nick outright when he turned 30. They further instructed that when he turned 35, he would receive the rest of the funds in his trust. These distributions are mandatory and unconditional." Now, Nick Reiner's team argues this trust was created way back in 1993. He was supposed to get some of it when he turned 30, which was before the alleged crime even happened. He's owed this money. Nick's team points the finger at the trustee of the trust, a man by the name of Paul Cannon, an attorney. Now, according to the LA Times, Nick was originally denied the trust at age 30 because there were questions about his competency. At the time, the trustee cited concerns for Nick's mental health and all of that. And this has been kind of a long-standing issue here. As we've reported, Nick has had a long and ongoing battle with addiction. On top of that, prior to his parents' death, he was reportedly diagnosed with schizophrenia. At the time of their murders, he was actually living inside his parents' guest house. And according to some reports, this was so that his parents could keep a closer eye on Nick as he struggled with his addiction and mental health issues. But according to Nick's civil attorneys, the status of Nick's mental health is irrelevant here. They point out he has not been found unfit to stand trial. In fact, proceedings continue to move forward. But even still, Nick's team says the trust fund money is, quote, "mandatory and unconditional, regardless of Nick's stability." And as his team has pointed out, this money would be used for his defense. And that leads to a bit of a backstory. Now, we mentioned Alan Jackson earlier in the episode. He's who Nick Reiner originally retained. Now, at the time, reports circulated that Nick's siblings, Jake and Romy, agreed to foot the bill for the defense. But then, reportedly, the tides turned and they backed out. And at that point, Nick reportedly didn't have enough money to fund Jackson and they parted ways. Here's what Alan Jackson said at the time.
"This morning, I had to withdraw as Nick Reiner's counsel. Circumstances beyond our control, but more importantly, circumstances beyond Nick's control, have dictated that, sadly, it's made it impossible for us to continue our representation of Nick. I'm legally and I'm ethically prohibited from explaining all the reasons why. I know that's a question on everybody's mind. We expect the public defender to step in. They've already been appointed and very capably protect Nick Reiner's interests as he moves forward through the system. But be clear, be very, very clear about this. My team and I remain deeply, deeply committed to Nick Reiner and to his best interests. In fact, we know, we're not just convinced, we know that the legal process will reveal the true facts of the circumstances surrounding this case, Nick's case. You know, a lot's been printed of late, over the last 3 weeks. A lot has been printed about Nick, printed about his family, printed about the circumstances. Speculation is in print. On December 15th, in the early morning hours, I was in New York at the time, and I got a call. Me and my team, we dropped everything. And for the last 3 weeks, we have devoted literally every waking hour to protecting Nick and his interests. We've investigated this matter top to bottom, back to front. What we've learned, and you can take this to the bank, is that pursuant to the laws of this state, pursuant to the law in California, Nick Reiner is not guilty of murder. Print that. Print that. We wish him the very, very best moving forward. And that's all I have today.
Okay, so do with that what you will, but it makes sense that Nick Reiner wants this money for a future defense, whether it's Alan Jackson or someone else. But that also brings into the question of California Probate Code 250, commonly known as the Slayer Statute. It reads, "A person who feloniously and intentionally kills the decedent is not entitled to any of the following: any property, interest, or benefit under a will of the decedent, or a trust created by or for the benefit of the decedent, or in which the decedent has an interest, including any general or special power of appointment conferred by the will or trust on the killer, and any nomination of the killer as executor, trustee, guardian, or conservator or custodian made by the will or trust." And we'll talk about this more in depth in our interview, but it begs the question, is Nick Reiner even eligible for this trust based on the crimes he's accused of? At the same time, he's only been accused, not convicted, meaning he's innocent until proven guilty, and he does have the right to a defense. And he's up against some major crimes here. I mean, 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances for the allegation that he used a knife in the murder. Some reports saying he allegedly slit the throats of his parents. And by the way, Nick Reiner could even face the death penalty for this based on the special circumstances. That's how serious all of this is. Now, he's pleaded not guilty to the charges, but investigators say he murdered his parents sometime in the early morning hours of December 14th, 2025, following Conan O'Brien's annual Christmas party. They were found inside their Brentwood mansion the following afternoon, and Nick was arrested hours later in the Exposition Park neighborhood. According to reports like from TMZ, after the murders, Nick checked into a hotel in Santa Monica and allegedly left behind bloody sheets and towels in the hotel room before he was arrested outside of a gas station. Since then, Reiner has been arraigned and pleaded not guilty, but the future of his defense is uncertain. All right, so the bottom line here, Nick Reiner wants money, but what are the odds of him actually getting it? That's just one of the questions I've got to ask today's special guest. It's Law and Crime legal counsel Elizabeth Vulai, who's been with Scandal really since its debut. Elizabeth, thank you for coming on our show. It's so good to see you. And okay, here's what I have to ask you. Do you think that Nick Reiner's team made a strong argument that he should receive at least part of his trust fund?
Yeah, In reading up about this, I do think that they made all of the arguments that his team should make. One of the things that they tried to point to was, the argument that this is an irrevocable trust, that the trustee, doesn't have authority to just simply withhold the funds. He can have authority to sort of preside over it and decide how it's distributed, but he can't completely withhold them. They had pointed to there's really no other way that he could pay for an adequate defense. And, obviously, this is a really tragic case. There's a lot of thoughts about it, but as a defendant, he is entitled to a defense. I think they went through all of the arguments that could be made. And also, one of the things that is interesting to note is, one of the things that they're arguing for this trust fund, which is in the sum of 1.5 million, is he was supposed to allegedly get at least half of it when he turned 30. A couple of years ago, he's 32, and he's supposed to get the remaining part of it when he's 35. So one of the arguments, which I think was one of the stronger arguments to make, is saying, this fund should have been dispersed to him even before, these alleged murders took place.
That was going to be one of the things that I was going to ask you about Elizabeth too, because he's 32 now, as you pointed out, was supposed to receive 50% of this trust fund back when he was 30. I don't know if it's really clear why he didn't receive whatever amount that would have been at the time, but I guess I'm wondering, as you pointed out, like this is the strong argument here that at the point his parents hadn't even been killed. I mean, he's accused of this. He's innocent until proven guilty. But do you think that will weigh heavily on the judge kind of deciding this? Because at the time he was supposed to receive a large chunk of this money, the crime hadn't even happened.
I think so. And one of the reasons that was discussed about in the reporting of this was that the trustee, so the attorney that was presiding over the trust, had concerns about the condition of his mental state. So it's been publicized, he's had mental health issues. He's been apparently diagnosed as schizophrenic. So that was one of the concerns that the trustee had was, well, if we disperse half of this huge sum of money to him, is he going to be able to be competent enough to know how to spend it and where to spend it? Now, obviously, the issue is the judge is going to know that he's going to be spending that money on his legal defense. So I think that's part of the complication too, is that the judge has full awareness of what he's going to be spending it on his legal defense. And also, there was reports about him being able to buy basic items in jail that he can no longer afford. And, I think when it comes to being able to receive inheritance to pay for his defense, that triggers all kinds of rules and, issues that we've been talking about, whether it's the Slayer rule or Son of Sam laws. So I think that's where the issue with the judge is going to come into play.
Okay, let's talk about this, the Slayer statute or law or whatever you want to call it out of California. And this is interesting. We talked about it during our episode today, but essentially, if you are convicted of a murder, let's say, of your parents, you wouldn't be allowed their inheritance. That just, wouldn't happen. That's not allowed. But in this case, does it matter that he has yet to be convicted? I mean, that's really the basis of our justice system here, is that he's accused of this crime, but he's innocent until proven guilty. He wants to use this money, this trust from his parents for his defense. But does it become tricky when he's accused of murdering them? I mean, how does the Slayer statute kind of factor in?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's like that's the perfect word to describe it as tricky. So the Slayer statute basically says that, if you have been determined to feloniously and intentionally, those are the, classic words that are used, feloniously and intentionally kill someone, you cannot then be able to seek inheritance from those victims or seek benefits from the victim's estate. So obviously here, that would be triggered if it's proven that he intentionally killed his parents, then there would be reasonably a blockage in him being able to get the inheritance. The issue is that there hasn't been a determination whether he's done that. So a lot of times the Slayer statute is triggered if there's been a criminal conviction. So if someone's been ruled guilty in a criminal court beyond a reasonable doubt after a trial, or interestingly, a probate court can actually make that determination as well. And that's a little bit of a lower standard, is by preponderance of the evidence. So you can have a probate court that can make the determination as to whether they feloniously or intentionally killed someone. And what I found out in my research, which was really interesting, is if someone can be acquitted in a criminal court, the probate court still has the ability to make that determination. So here it's kind of tricky because they can't really make that determination as to whether he can get the inheritance until he's deemed guilty or innocent. But a lot of times probate courts can make the determination before a criminal trial. They're just really hesitant to a lot of times because they don't want to interfere with the criminal case in that process. So it's really interesting in terms of timing with this.
Oh, wow. It's so interesting that you could be acquitted, let's say, and the probate court could still be like, nah, you're not getting it. And I guess it's all coming down to timing, right? Because in the petition, his team, Nick Reiner's team, is like, time is of the essence. We need to build a defense. We need to have the money for this. So you said that a probate court is sometimes hesitant to kind of rule on this ahead of time. Do you think they would have, breathing down their neck to kind of move forward with this so that Nick Reiner's team could use the money? I mean, what are your thoughts about all that?
They can possibly. I think there's going to be some strong sentiment from the probate court or the judge because, he's been accused of murdering his parents. And again, the main reason he wants to be able to access this fund is to pay for his defense. I do think the strongest argument, as mentioned, is that he was entitled to half of this prior to these acts occurring. So I think if anything, perhaps what we might see is a ruling that, okay, he might be entitled to the first half of the money because, the trust had stated he was entitled to this when he was 30 before these murders took place. So I could see that happening. I could also see a judge making the determination to just freeze all the assets for now. It's a little bit tough though, because again, he is a defendant. He's entitled to a defense. Right now he has a public defender, which is obviously free of charge. But, I think there are some arguments that he could make in that he's entitled to be able to have a defense. He wants to have the money to access getting a private attorney of his own choosing. And because some of this money was available before these murders took place, his team is trying to make the argument that he should be entitled to it. So I think in all likelihood, we'll probably see maybe him getting half of that initial sum or a judge making just the determination, we're just freezing the assets and you'll go ahead with a public defender. But the laws are really protective of defendants and the rights that they have to retain counsel and get defense. So I think we also will see that a judge doesn't want to risk being overruled or being deemed to have taken his constitutional right to have a defense taken away.
I think that's the perfect segue into the Alan Jackson of it all. Because if anybody has been following this case, you know that originally Nick Reiner was repped by Alan Jackson, who, of course, any Law&Crime Court TV fans know, he represented Kevin Spacey and, he has been acquitted of all charges. He represented Karen Reed here in Massachusetts. Also, she's been acquitted of the charges. So Alan Jackson, really a heavyweight with any sort of defense team. Nick Reiner gets him, okay, great, everything's cool, until it seems like he doesn't have the money to foot the bill for Alan Jackson, and now he's got the public defender. So let's say that he does get this money. I mean, do you think it really could help his defense to have someone like Alan Jackson?
I do. I think so. Alan Jackson is a really high profile attorney. He did have to withdraw from the case quite early on, and the reasons were unclear at the time. So now that more of this information is coming to light, I think a lot of people are making the assumption that it was that Nick Reiner couldn't afford him. So I think having someone like that with a track record is absolutely optimal for a defendant like this. I think this is a really difficult case, just given Nick Reiner's history of, mental illness and, prior acts that have happened in their family beforehand. And, obviously the tragic way that his parents were killed within the home. So I think there's a lot of facts and evidence so far that seems to go against Nick Reiner. So being able to have an attorney like Alan Jackson, who has that, history of being able to have defendants be acquitted and have that track record, that's someone that, you always need in a case like this, where the facts are so grisly. It's the added element of it's his parents and just the public sentiment of it all. I mean, obviously, there's always a strong public sentiment and reaction to a murder case, but when it involves, family members, that's something we cover all the time here on Law&Crime. But especially when it's a child being accused of murdering their parents, I think the public sentiment is even stronger. So I definitely think that's someone he wants to have on his side. And I'm sure his public defender is really capable. There are great public defenders in California and all across this country, but to be able to retain, counsel of your own choosing and a private attorney who has that kind of track record, I think it makes sense why they're trying to pursue this.
I mean, as you pointed out, the facts against him are really harsh. And again, at this point, we mostly know all of the information that we have is from the prosecution or from investigators who are working with the prosecution. So we don't necessarily know what is up the defense's sleeve. But from what the facts are that we know, it does look pretty tough. And to your point, too, I mean, I remember actually texting you specifically after this happened, and we were like, Rob Reiner, what? Oh my God. And then you add the factor that not only is this a beloved person and his wife killed in their own home, allegedly by their child, then the way in which it happened. I believe you even said grisly. I mean, the facts of the case are really tough. So I can understand him wanting to have, this top notch attorney to kind of help with his case. And that kind of leads into my next question, too. This is kind of off from what we were talking about, but I do have to wonder, what sort of defense could Nick Reiner even bring? I mean, you talked about his mental health issues in the past. That's something that the trustee was kind of citing back when he was 30 years old as to not give him the money at the time, allegedly. What do you think they would bring for a defense? Could it be a mental health situation? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think if he had made the choice to plead guilty, then, they would absolutely cite to his mental health. We've seen various cases where a defendant pleads guilty, but then they invoke the insanity plea, or they say they weren't of sound mind, or, they'll try to push, instead of a murder conviction, manslaughter, which carries much less time. So I think that could be a possibility. But since he's pleading not guilty, I think a lot of it will point to what we've seen in many criminal cases of attorneys saying, well, where's the evidence? Where is there a video, a home camera demonstrating he did this? What other witnesses were in the home? What sort of DNA evidence links him to the crime? I think we see in a lot of cases, obviously OJ being prime example that we always go back to, where a lot of people in the public eye make the connection between the alleged defendant and the acts that took place, and a lot of evidence, people see it as sort of obvious, but then the defense attorney's job is to say, well, here are the gaps in the evidence, and you can't really point to whether he was there at that time, what witnesses were around, what the DNA evidence specifically says. So I think, if there's a change in the plea to guilty, I think we're going to see them try to push and go towards the mental health aspect. But if it's not guilty, and that's the plea that he's going to stick with, I think we're going to see a lot of the defense attorneys trying to poke holes in whatever evidence they show. And we also saw that a little bit in the filing as well, for him to access the trust fund. One of the arguments they try to make is, he hasn't been, deemed incompetent by a judge. There's been no ruling in terms of whether it's from a jury or a judge on his mental health. So it seems like they're trying to push away the mental health issues and aspect as far as they can for now.
Okay, Elizabeth, I think you're totally right about this, because initially I thought mental health, that's what they've got to go with. But based on the filing and everything that we've seen recently, I mean, I don't know if that's the route that they were going to go. And I guess something we talked about early on in this case is the siblings, because we have to remember the fact that Nick Reiner, who's accused of killing his parents, he has two other siblings, a brother and a sister, who the brother has been outspoken about it. The sister allegedly found her parents. I mean, just a tragic situation overall. And I'm wondering if they have any sort of voice in all of this. Just the fact that the trustee is the one who's going to kind of determine, at least at this point until a judge gets involved, whether Nick Reiner can receive the trust. But I'm wondering if the siblings are saying, hey, we don't want him to have that money. We don't want him to have the trust at this point. Does their voice count for anything?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can't really see it counting for much. So allegedly what happened is that the parents set up separate trusts for each of the children. So, Nick was set up with a trust, as were the other children, completely separately. I think if this was a joint trust where all of the children were entitled to some sort of money jointly, I think they'd have more of a say. I think the issue here is that this was a completely separate trust set up for him with these age parameters in place. So I don't think legally and in terms of a determination by a judge or the probate court, it's going to carry too much weight. I'm sure obviously public sentiment, because we always say there's two courts, the court of public opinion and the legal court. So I think the court of public opinion, their opinion obviously matters a great deal. And I know there were reports that they allegedly were helping fund some of his defense in the beginning, and that sort of apparently tapered off. So, the siblings have an involvement here, but as to whether, their thoughts are if he should be entitled to that trust fund for his defense or not, I don't think it's going to carry too much weight, just because, again, it's a completely separate trust set up solely for him.
You brought up a good point, the court of public opinion and then the justice system court, because when I think about this case, I always think about the siblings, because I mean, my sister and I think if she was accused in the death of our parents, we're supposed to be mourning together the loss. And then it creates a whole other level of just depravity in this. And again, he is innocent until proven guilty. He's just, accused of these charges. But I'm sure psychologically that's doing a lot to the siblings. And that kind of leads into my next question. So we talked about the Slayer statute, but also kind of in that realm is the son of Sam laws, because previously I had reported that Nick Reiner, there were reports out there that from behind bars, he wanted to write this tell-all book. Assumedly, it was because he wanted to raise funds for his defense. But I'm wondering if this would be allowed, because based on the Son of Sam laws, you can't profit from a crime you're convicted of. However, he hasn't been convicted. So, I mean, what can you tell me about the Son of Sam laws?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it comes up a lot here at Law&Crime, right? Because, we cover a lot of these kinds of cases, and, when you have defendants participating, whether you're producing a movie or, a docuseries or a book, that's when the Son of Sam laws come into play. So there's about 40 states across America that have Son of Sam laws, and basically what they are, and it varies depending state by state, but it's either a prohibition preventing defendants from being able to, participate or completely manage writing books, movies, docuseries based on their life and especially the crime they've been convicted of. In California, it's really interesting because in 2002, the Son of Sam laws were struck down because they were too overbroad. So now, apparently what is going on in that state for a while now is that defendants aren't completely prohibited from writing books or movies or, related items based on their crimes. But there's been an extension in terms of, family members of the victim and how they can sue. So in California, you have 10 years from when a defendant has been released on parole for the victim's families to be able to sue to recover some of those profits. So, you can have a defendant, write a book or work on a movie or whatever the project might be within California, but their rights to retain the profit from that is really, really restricted. And the families are afforded, a long period of time to try to pursue that revenue. So he could pursue that. A lot of defendants, who have been accused of some of these crimes and similar crimes really do that. And especially here, I think it's something that might be a strong likelihood because it is involving people in Hollywood. It's a huge amount of public attention on this kind of case. So I wouldn't be surprised if something like that came up, but his ability to retain the profits from it would be really, really limited. And I'm sure the siblings might have strong feelings about that. Other members of the family would have strong feelings about it.
This case is so layered, because I think if this case was in middle America, I'll call it my home state, Wisconsin. If this happened in Wisconsin and a son is accused of murdering his two parents, we'd cover it here on Law&Crime. But I think it adds to it the fact that it's Rob Reiner, that before that they were at Conan O'Brien's Christmas party. There was Jane Fonda there allegedly, and Bill Hader. I mean, the celebrity of it all makes everyone want to know more, just because we are generally enamored with celebrities. So this case in general is it's such a crazy one. And just to put a bow on everything, Elizabeth, what are your thoughts? Do you think that a judge is going to rule in the favor of Nick Reiner that he will receive at least some of this trust fund?
I think there's a strong likelihood that a judge may rule that he's entitled to at least half of it, because again, that was triggered prior to these actions taking place. So I could see a judge either stating, okay, you're entitled to the initial half of it, because the remaining half, again, he's not supposed to get until he's the age of 35, and his attorneys are making the argument, this is an irrevocable trust. The trustee shouldn't have complete discretion about whether the funds should be dispersed or not. So I could see either a judge saying, okay, you're entitled to the first half of this fund, or completely placing a hold on it and having him continue with the public defender. I am ruling a little bit in favor of the first option because, again, a defendant's right to, a defense and to be able to retain an attorney of their choosing is a really strong right. Judges don't want to be overruled when it comes to that. So I think I'm leaning a little bit more towards the first option, but I wouldn't be surprised if a judge said, you know what, you have a public defender, you're entitled to a defense, we're freezing the assets, and the trial is going to go forward. So I think it's going to be one or the two. I don't see a likelihood of him getting the entire sum of money. No.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think he might receive at least some, and it could help with his defense. Obviously, you said that's his right as an American. And I'll be interested to see what sort of defense that he's going to bring. Elizabeth Vulai, thank you for coming on Scandal with us and breaking down this really complicated case.
Thank you so much for having me, Sierra. It's always a pleasure.
And that's where today's episode of Scandal leaves us for now. If you like what you saw and you want to see more or connect with me on social media, you can find me on places like Instagram at Sierra Gillespie. Thanks for watching today's episode of Scandal. As always, I'm your host, Sierra Gillespie, and I'll see you next time.